We're going to move now to Donna Roy. We're very honored to have her here to open the afternoon session, which is on open data and election innovation. Our motivation for this next roundtable came from the concept of data as a liberator of democracy. Open data is a revolution in IT and governmental reform, and this, of course, must include elections. Donna's very long title doesn't need to be, you don't need to watch me try to do that tongue twister, but it's up there. I think what's most important to know is that Donna was recently named one of the Fierce 15 by Fierce Government IT in recognition of 15 federal employees who've done particularly innovative things. This, coupled with her work as the executive director of NEAM, and her deep awareness of cybersecurity make her really the perfect opening keynote speaker for our afternoon session. I'm going to bring you right on. Please welcome Donna Roy.
I'd like to open my talk today just by thanking you for allowing me to come to talk to you. So I hope you're enjoying the little energy and the energetic buzz in this town after the inauguration, right? Can you still feel it, the sort of excitement around the parties? And I mean, outside of the cold, I think it's been a great week for you to be here, right? So I love this time of the year in my hometown, D.C. So I'm here to sort of share with you a little bit of passion I have around data and innovation. Now, some of you may have heard or been following our White House strategy on digital government. You might have heard Todd Parks, very dynamic speaker, talk about open data and how data is changing democracy, how we're using open data to sort of change for citizens the way government sort of deals with some of the things. And so they talk a lot about open data, machine data. So I'm going to be a little bit of a buzzkill because I follow up with him and say, yeah, but what about? But what about, right? So what about the types of things? What about privacy? What about security? What about integrity of the data, right? So I'm a little bit of a buzzkill after him. But I think we have a lot of the same issues. So I will say I'm not as energetic, but I love my job. And let me tell you how I got to this job. It's sort of important to understand me a little bit. I went to boot camp in Welcome. Come on in. Take a seat. Thank you. So I started my career in information technology about 30 years ago. I signed up for boot camp, decided to get myself out of New Hampshire in a bad economy, so I joined the Marine Corps. It seemed like a good solution. When I was 20, it seemed like a good solution, right? No? So I went to boot camp, go after boot camp, learn how to be someone who types and files, because I thought, well, you know, I could do that and have fun and see the world. You know, those banners, see the world, be a Marine, serve your country, and get out of New Hampshire. I was thinking just get out of New Hampshire in a bad economy when interest rates were 18%. It was not a great time to be in New Hampshire when they're closing the factories and you thought maybe you'd have to live at home forever. So I joined the Marine Corps. I showed up at my first duty station that I got to pick because I was so brilliant at typing and filing. I meet what I find to be a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps. So I'm out of boot camp, all shiny, spiffy, love my uniform, you know, gung-ho, as they say. And I get to this lieutenant colonel. He looks like he's got his, you know, his sleeves up. He's missed a belt loop. His shoes are not shiny. They're anything but shiny. His mustache is out of regulation. And he basically doesn't even talk to me. He grunts. And this is the guy I'm going to work for. And he pulls me into a computer room. And he sort of opens the door. It was cold. It was dark. The windows were painted. And he almost shoved me in. It feels better when you say that, right? So he throws me in the computer room. He grunts. He says, there's tape drives, there's platters, there's terminals here, there's 50 users out there. I expect you to be programming by the end of the month. And he closes the door, right? I know how to type. I know how to type, and there's these computer terminals. Like, well, that's sort of interesting. I know how to type. I don't want to talk to that man. I'm not leaving this door. I'm not leaving. So, I found a book on a shelf, and I said, well, it has a keyboard. Maybe I can do this. So that's where I started. And I did eventually learn how to program. Took a few weeks for me to figure out how to read the books. And about 8 months later, in October of 1983, don't know if you remember, I started my relationship with terrorism, right? So on that day, the barracks in Lebanon were bombed. 241 of my Marine partners, my brothers, were killed sleeping in their racks, right? My job in that is 20-something years old. My job was to stand overnight and wait for the phone to ring. If you're as old as I am, you remember the phone, and I would answer it, and I would stick it in the suction cup modem, right? And then shaking, because I couldn't, I didn't want to screw up, because I had to take care of that man who was, grumpy. And type in these AT commands to sort of tell the modem how to receive the data from Germany so that we could get an accurate list of the people who were still missing, the people whose bodies were found. And so we could start chipping away and getting information to the people around, their sons, their daughters, their brothers, right? And so 21 years old, terrorism, and the importance of accurate, correct information exchange in a world where, it was pretty shaky back then. If I never understood what happened if I just pulled that thing off the modem. Where did the data go, right? Was there a retransmission? Did I just lose some critical? I was scared, really scared as a kid. So that was the beginning of my career. And so I get out, do some brilliant Beltway Bandit stuff, go into IT. About 6 years later, a friend of mine called and said, I'm working here at the Department of Homeland Security. I know you're out there, you have your own company, you're doing brilliant things, having fun, but I'd like you to take this job. Here's a couple of reasons why. I can't fill it. No one else wants it. So I must have been the end of the Rolodex. And in this job, the person before you, no one liked him. So if you were to take this job, you're really going to have to work uphill because, people didn't like the job he was doing, so they didn't like what he was doing, and so you're coming in with this bias against you. It is the Department of Homeland Security. I know it's sort of chaotic and, a lot of bad press and everything. He said, but there's a parking space, and there's a free gym, and it's a better commute than what you've got today. And so, of course, I took the job, right? So being the Marine, I'm like, well, sure, that sounds like luxury. When I got there, I realized my job was big and important, but people didn't want to talk about it. And people don't want to talk about data, right? I think we live in a world of data. I think the government in general is in the information business. We are in the information business. We're not sort of in any other business than moving around information, trusting information. Sort of information is our business. So I got to the Department of Homeland Security, and I was in charge of all of the data and understanding all of the data in the Department of Homeland Security. Like, awesome, right? So they've been open for a few years. They must know where all the data is. I could just walk in and start, putting things together. And I got there, and I had someone deliver me a spreadsheet. I had 20 rows on it. 20 things they knew, 20 databases they knew. Like, this is a big department. We only have 20 databases? So it took me like a year and a half to make progress on that. But one of the tools that I did sort of have immediately was a partner from the Department of Justice immediately called on me within 2 weeks and said, hey, you need to know me. You need to know what we're working on together. You didn't know we were working on it, but guess what? You inherited this thing with me. We're going to change the world. Again, so I'm like, oh, awesome. I want to meet you. You have a lot of energy, and we're going to change the world. It's what I came here for. Parking space, gym, and world-changing activity. And he introduced me to the National Information Exchange Model Program. Has anyone ever heard of that program? So yeah, a few of you, right? So I'm like, I don't know. After I met with him, you have a lot of energy. I like you. Maybe we'll do something, but I don't know. It just seems like a hard sell. And I kept my head down, and I did my Homeland Security business for about a year, and I kept him at bay. I'm like, yeah. And about a year later, I sort of got it, right? I really got what he was trying to do. And And when I tell you, I'm really proud about where we've taken the National Information Exchange model. So where I sit, just to sort of talk about my challenges, and then we'll sort of, I think, talk about how they parallel yours. So some of the questions I get, and they're really easy to sort of to answer, are in the petabytes of data within the Department of Homeland Security. Data we've collected about good people doing good things, all good data, nothing, you'd want to share with people like the CIA or anything like that, just good people doing good things. Where are the bad people? Where are the ones? In all of that big vast of data, how do we get the bad people out? Right? I'm like, oh, yes, let me write a program. I'll have that in 5 minutes, right? Oh, wait, so that's a big challenge, right? So figuring out how you protect the data while you try to find the small amount of people who are sort of in those databases in order to sort of cull the intelligence to be able to keep the Homeland Security, the Homeland Enterprise safe, right? It's a sort of a big job, small job. So in that job, we run into a lot of sort of challenges, and I think I've heard some of them today. We still have processes in this world of trying to keep the homeland safe, where phone, fax, and sort of sneaker net methods are the way we move information around, right? And a lot of that's because of trust, and a lot of that's because of old IT systems. Some of these IT systems were there before I got thrown into that computer room 30 years ago, right? Some of them sort of almost predate me in birth, it seems like. And so how do you make change in a department where there are 800 or so computer systems, some of them older than me, some of them just about a minute ago? And how do you start moving information around so that people can start querying it in a way that protects it, but also allows us to use that information to make this country safer? So it's a small thing. And so when I met with Mr. Paul, who was then the executive director of the National Information Exchange Model, and so I'm totally off script now. So tell my staff that thank you for the 10 pages of notes. And so I met with him, and I started to understand how you make change, right? So creating, NEAM provides communities to come together, most important, to come together and focus on a single problem, create a standardized way to start moving information on that problem, and then to work on governing and implementing it. I mean, I think I'm hearing a lot of what you want to do here are those same types of things, right? Standardize information so that we all know what we mean when we get the same thing. Name. Eye color is an amazingly complex thing, just so you know. In the department, we have 22 agencies, sort of, right? 6 or 7 big ones. So we have 6 or 7 times 10 times definitions of eye color. So one agency might have 16 colors, another agency might have 5 colors. How do you map violet? Where does that go to someone who's only got 5 colors? Right? These are sort of complex issues. We have more than 3 values of sex in some of our databases. Not quite sure how that got there. So, and so these are complex issues, but the community, when they come together, they solve these, right? They create these standardized ways to exchange the information. One in my database, it's called this. When you map it, this is what it should be, right? And so NEAM provides those tools to allow you to do that. It's not magic. So NEAM, as a program, came out of a handful of local justice implementers, people who wanted to share law enforcement data across a few state boundaries. They said, I have this problem, you have this problem. Let's create this XML data model so that we can at least, across our 4 or 5 or maybe 6 states, figure out how to share it better so that we can automate more transactions, right? Because in law enforcement, time is lives, right? Time is lives. And so they did that, and they created a really, really precursor to NEAM. So today, that early work, probably about 6, 7 years ago, when I get stopped, as occasionally happens when I'm driving my Volvo, which should be under the radar, but it's not, a little too fast, or perhaps I don't watch the signs on the street, I get stopped, right? Happens to some of us in the room. That police officer has 15 minutes to figure out what to do with Donna Roy. Is Donna a terrorist? Is Donna a bad person? Is she on a warrant? I mean, should I arrest her? Should I maybe give her a warning, which is what I'm always voting for? Oh, should I give her a ticket? Is this, do I also give her a violation for not having her car emissions? I had this one recently, not have my car emissions test on time. They catch you on those things. So that process in the car where the police officer queries 50 states worth of data, because this is all locally reported data, locally stewarded data, right? 50 states of data. All of that happens within sub-seconds, right? Before he even gets out of his car, he reads my license plate reader. That query goes back. All of that happened because a few people at the local level got together and said, this is a problem. I want to solve this problem because I want my police officers to be safer, right? That is what NEAM is all about. That is what that community of people who get together and solve these problems is all about. So as my day job, I really love working on the terrorism issues because I'm still pissed off about October 1983, right? I knew some people in that embassy. Still pissed off. On the other part of my job, where I talk about NEAM communities, and I get to work with communities who are coming together to solve these problems, boy, that just sort of says, I'm in the right, this is why I love my job. I am in the right place in time. I get to work on things that matter to me, and that are having an impact on society. So I'm going to tell you, we're having sort of a lot of the same issues, right? So I'm betting someone's asked someone in this community, how many people voted in the last election? Right? So you guys have that, right? Right? You had it the next day, right? Yeah, you had it the next day. With a lot of accuracy, you had it the next day, right? Oh, no, that was American Idol. We had that one the next day, right? Oh, and that one had more people voting in American Idol than the election. Yeah, so there's some challenges in this community, right? Sort of gathering that data, getting correct sort of information, finding across all of the ways you report. And so Susan shared with me, one district might have multiple ways to sort of talk about a ballot, multiple versions of a ballot, right? Sort of multiple versions of a ballot. For one district, how many districts are there in the U.S.? I can understand the challenge of sort of figuring out how to get that number, right? Where's the magical number? Then you get people overseas. You don't know how many people overseas, how many citizens should have voted, how many could have voted. You've got the issues around the ballots. I heard the fax. I love that. I thought all the fax machines were dead too, but apparently they're not. And so we have some similar challenges. So I want to talk a little bit about one use case. I can get to the notes here so I won't waste my staff's time. Page 6. Tell them I'm using page 6. Okay. So how many people knew from 1992 to 2003 that a little over 15 million Americans abused prescription drugs? 15 million Americans abusing prescription drugs. So, interesting. That's more than cocaine, hallucinogens, and inhalants and heroin combined. More than illegal drugs, more than the big bad illegal drugs, people are misusing prescription drugs. So what's even more worse? How many people have teens in their household? All right, I love this. How many have grandchildren? You just know about teens in their life, right? 1 out of 5 teens are abusing prescription drugs. 40% of them think it's safer than illegal drugs. Painkillers are not addictive, right? If I find it in my grandmother's cabinet, it's not addictive. She takes it. She's 80. I'll survive it, right? This is a problem today. And it's not something NEAM solves directly, right? But these are alarming statistics. There's a community of people who have gotten together and figured out that there is a gap in interstate reporting. Another statistic, 20%, less than 20% of the prescriptions written in California are for California residents. Less than 20%. Sort of says there's a drug diversion problem in this country where we're doing a pretty good job at understanding the prescriptions within a state. But what about the state-to-state reporting, right? Can the surrounding states see the California ones? Can they see what's leaving? Do they understand? All right? This is the network that you're trying to solve the problem across. And I love these numbers because it scares you when you think about the complexity of it. 1.6 million prescribers, doctors who write scripts. 1.6 million in this country. It's a lot to keep track of. 284,000 pharmacists, people who filled them. 73,000 pharmacies, right? And then you've got 18,000 police departments trying to catch the people doing it, right? 800,000 cops on the beat. trying to get the drugs off the street, and you've got 11,000 substance addiction treatment centers. So across all of those, somewhere is the information necessary to start understanding diversion, to start controlling diversion, arresting people who are doing the diversion, finding the bad doctors, finding the pharmacists who understand and filling the bad doctors' prescriptions anyway, sort of finding the people who are going across state boundaries to get all of the prescriptions filled, because a $10, $20 sort of prescription through an insurance transaction of Dilaudid is $10,000 in street value, right? $10,000, $20 to $10,000. There's a huge market for this, and yet we are inequipped as a country to sort of understand the information as it moves around to solve these problems. So yay, NEAM, right? Go NEAM. This community that wanted to solve this problem started to put together an understanding of what information they would need to move across state boundaries so that they can track these types of transactions, right? They put a stake in the sand. They said, here's the data, here's the types of information, and here's how we want to structure it. And then for the geeks like me, here's the XML code, and here's how we move it around. But mostly, here are the rules, and then here are the legislative fixes we are already working on so that we can share the data. So we're still in this prescription drug monitoring exchange sort of program at the phase where some states are still looking at their legislation, still trying to understand what they can share with their neighboring sort of states and stay compliant with their laws, so their privacy structures. And they're starting to make progress. And so they're piloting this in a few areas. They're already starting to see sort of prosecutions. They're attacking the drug diversion problem by understanding where the information is not moving, standardizing that, and then governing it, getting agreement to use that small standard, that sort of definition of how to move the data around. And so to me, that's a huge sort of success. Did my small NEAM program have anything to do with that? Absolutely not, right? So they did this because they found NEAM. They found this on a website. They knew some people. They knew some guys, right, from the law enforcement work that they've done before. And they just started doing the work. And we sort of found out about it by chance, right? And so I would say that this is a program, one of my favorite programs, that I spend a lot of my time on, trying to make sure that we are, from a federal government, not ruining it. Because the federal government can do that, right? We can help so much that we kill something. It's okay, you can laugh. I've only been a Fed for 6 years. I'm not a lifetime Fed yet. So we're trying not to ruin it. We're trying to stay clear with the intent of these small communities of people who want to come together and fix a problem, who just want to come together and sort of put in place ways to do business differently, right? And so I would challenge you. I know there are some standards-based works sort of going around in this arena. I know David Weber's following me up with a panel to talk a little bit about this. I would challenge this community to sort of engage in that process, because if there's a little bit of roll your sleeves up work to get done, to understand what problems you want to solve, and to start articulating ways to do that, right? Maybe it's can we get a count faster? Maybe it's another particular problem. I can't sort of guess for you what problems are the highest priority, but I think if you came together and tried to create standardized ways of moving information around, you'll start to see progress, right? So I challenge you to do that. That's one of my big challenges. And if you need some help from the NEAM program, we'd be happy to sort of share best practices, more importantly, hook you up with communities of people who are doing similar things, and have you sort of understand how they're attacking the problem, right? Because it's, to me, it's almost a professional matchmaker. There are other people in the country trying to do similar things for different business purposes, but similar things. And I spend a lot of time trying to connect you so that you can learn from each other. A lot of like what you're trying to do here at these forums. And so I challenge you to talk about standards and adopt standards. The second thing I want to challenge you about is sort of combating cyber threat and not losing your drive for innovation. I love technology when it makes my life easier. I liked it a little less this week because someone hacked into my Twitter account. I like Twitter. It lets me sort of talk to my NEAM community in a way that I can do with my attention span, 140 characters at a time, and get the word out frequently during the day. But someone hacked into it, and all of a sudden I'm like, there's another thing I have to worry about. So understanding, I think, today more than ever, It's everyone's responsibility to understand what that cyber threat is, right? What it means to sort of click on a phishing email, right? What it means to say, I should really understand that URL before I do something from that. Maybe that doesn't look suspicious. I think it's on everyone to understand what that means. Now, if I put my DHS hat on, I have had the classified briefings. You know, the cyber threat is not getting smaller. The cyber threat is not getting smaller. It is more pervasive. I've heard some of our cyber people, this has scared the crap out of me a little bit, say there are two types of people who run systems in the context of a cyber guy, right? Those who know they've been penetrated and are doing something about it. And those who don't know they've been penetrated and have no idea. There are just two kinds of IT people, right? And that in itself is a harrowing threat. I mean, that sort of says, you know, the threat is pervasive, right? I run some of the systems in the Department of Homeland Security that we're trying to increase security controls on, right? Trying to increase identity proofing and credentialing and making sure that we know who signs on. It's that same person I met in person and verified who they are, right? So I challenge you all to sort of get a little more educated on the cyber threat. But I don't want you to sort of stop innovating and stop moving forward with these open data initiatives. I just think it's going to take us all a little more time to figure this out and a little more time to sort of balance. And it's about shared risk management, right? Shared risk management. How much can I automate to make the world better versus how much risk, you know, in that process of automation. It's shared risk management. That's how we're looking at it in the federal government. But I would say it is up to us, it is up to you to take and do your part. It's my cheerleading speech, right? Read a cyber blog once in a while. Try not to participate in phishing activities. Understand how to read a URL and know it's not sort of what's the most hacked Bank of America, right? There's a lot of Bank of America schemes out there. I'm not a Bank of America person, but I hear about this in the news. So I read. I sort of try to investigate. It's my job too. But I think it's everyone's job to understand a little more about what the current threat is. But the most important thing to me, and the most important thing to my Aunt May, who I carry around in my pocket, she's my favorite person in the world, is how we consistently sort of protect privacy, civil rights, civil liberties of our U.S. citizens. This is important to me. In my day job, it gets a little dark, right? The types of things I do. And that's why I keep my Aunt May in my pocket. She's my favorite person in the whole world. She has done nothing but good things, followed the law, done awesome things in her life. Good, hard-working, blue-collar American woman. I just love her to death. I don't want her information sent to the CIA. Don't want her information inappropriately used for anything. It's my Aunt May, right? There's no reason to do that. So I have taken 6 years to understand how to build privacy in by design, to understand why we have this web of privacy laws, understand what that really means, what the Privacy Act of 1974 means to me as a citizen, to my Aunt May in my pocket as I carry around. And I've spent a lot of time understanding what that conversation means so that I can advise how to build better IT systems, right? How to build better IT systems. And so in the law, there's this expectation. Well, first is how many people use Google? Yeah, how many people trust that Google's doing good things with your data when you move around the web? Yeah, all right. How many people use Facebook? Yes, I used to get my godchildren, right? How many people trust Facebook? Not even one. Yeah, that's good. Don't trust them. They change their privacy stuff on a daily basis. How many people trust Amazon? We've got Amazon in there. How many people? I trust Amazon. I leave my credit card number on Amazon. I trust Amazon. Why do I trust them more than I trust Google? Why? Right? Because they provide value back? Because they give me good book recommendations? Or is there something else? Right? And so when I start talking about protecting privacy, I think we're starting to think differently about trust. Right? So I bucket trust, off script now, probably get in trouble. I bucket trust in 4 things. Trust in the person or the identity of the person I'm dealing with. I know you are who you are because we have a process to verify your identity, and I'm doing this transaction with you with some level of trust that it is you. That's important. And a lot of our systems now, a lot of the focus on securing IT is around that one thing, trust, right? So let me break that a little bit. I'm going to give someone in this room my credit card, and I'm just going to walk away. I don't know you. I don't know anyone here except David Weber, who I would not give my credit card. So I have no trust in you, and yet I'm giving you something that could potentially do some financial harm, end up on my credit score, end up sort of a bad credit score, and my job means revocation of a security clearance. So it's a big harm for me, right? So why would I do that, right? Because I trust there's processes behind there that would say the banks understand there's a risk. They're sharing that risk with me. I can call the bank, cancel that credit card, understand I'm not liable for any of the fraudulent charges, right? There's a process I trust because the banks have all gotten together and put trust in that process across their network. So I can build systems, I can implement sort of technologies without trusting you, right? Because there are ways to mediate and mitigate that trust. And so the second thing, in addition to trust and identity, and I do believe trust and identity is very important in my day job, trust and identity, but also that's not the only key, right? Trust in process. Trust in process, that I understand the sound process, is a piece of it in my mind. The third thing is trust in governance. So when the process breaks, something happens. Like I'm not left holding the bag. Someone else has made a promise to share that risk. Trust in the governance of that, right? That's important. So I think we roll out a lot of IT systems with trust on the identity, not a lot of trust in the process. So that last one I want to leave you with is trust in the data. So the data that I sent in a transaction is the same data that went to stop B, stop C, stop 3, gets counted at the end of the day as I voted. Same data. Trust in the data throughout that transaction. So I think if we start thinking about building systems and innovating with layers of trust and understanding it's not just trust of identity, it's not just trust of data, but there's something around process, something around governance, right? That communities can come together and understand to do what the banking industry's done. So that I know I can give you my credit card, walk out, and mitigate my damages, right? I understand that as a citizen, as a banker. So I want to leave you with that because I think we have a lot of shared sort of interests, right? I think that any gains that you make are ones I want to steal as a community, right? Or, I'm sorry, share best practices and leverage for good government. Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot my bureaucratic ease there. So I think as a community with sort of shared challenges, these are the only way we get better is by learning from each other and by sort of pushing that envelope. So I do want to leave it for some questions. You might have some questions for me. If you ask me a voting question, I will defer. I voted. That's all I'm going to tell you. I voted. I didn't like the process, but I voted. So anyway, do you have any questions? Yes, sir, right here in front.
I'm curious as to whether you have any thoughts of whether signature is eroding or is going to erode away as the biometric we use for ID. It seems to me when I go to the grocery store and I go over some plastic screen with a stylus, that's not my signature, but now it's on record somewhere as my signature, and that this is eroding right away. Do you have any thoughts on where that might be going?
Yeah, Donna Roy has thoughts. I'm not sure the Department of Security has vetted my thoughts on this, so I'll say that I'm answering as a citizen, Donna Roy. That's my bureaucratic hat on. I think signatures, what do they do with that thing I scribble on, right? They certainly, the way we used to interact with the banks was they would match the signatures, right? And then they would catch the mismatches when everything was human processed, even mismatches on checks, right? And then they would not cash that check. That was the safeguard, right? The mismatch on the signature. No one does anything with that signature other than record it to say, in the process, I have a way to say someone signed for that, right? So I think it's a artifact of the old way of doing business. So I think signatures, the way we know of them today, are artifacts of the old way of doing business. I think we can innovate and think ahead of that, right? So I would like to sign, in the department, we have electronic signatures. So when I use my card to sort of do things, I can sign forms with my PIV card. My ID card, I can sign. Now, there's no signature. Donna Roy didn't sign it, but there's an electronic trace that I signed it. I'm the only one that saw it, and I approved it, and I get to approve things like travel and, sort of all kinds of things with an electronic non-signed signature, right? And I think you're going to see more of that, because I think the old way of doing business and just automating the old way of doing business gets us nowhere, right? So I just sort of, I think I can take one more question. Way in the back, sir.
Where do you think facial recognition is going in the broader process of identity?
So I know it's being used extensively in Homeland Security arenas. I'm going to talk about one case that's being used and used very effectively. So it might not surprise you that people are trying to game the system to come into the country. Might not surprise you, people are trying to break the rules to be a U.S. citizen. It's a great country to be in. I can understand that mentality, right? So people apply, and you have to, part of the application, you have to have a picture, right? Apply from my embassy, picture of me. So we're using face recognition to call out fraud. Very effective, right? Very effective technology to sort of call out, I could change my hair color, but the distance between my eyes stays the same, you know. So I think that it's a very effective technology. I think you have to figure out where it's useful, because it is CPU intensive. It's sort of gathering those photos and understanding it, processing it. You know, that's intensive, and we have those resources, but not sort of a lot of distributed sort of types of problems have those resources. I think irises, a lot more biometric technologies coming your way. The Canadians are using iris to sort of cross the border instead of fingerprints, right? They use iris coming into the U.S. We use fingerprints going out. Maybe we should be using iris. So, and so I think biometrics is something you should watch as a technology to help. But that's only sort of addressing that one thing, right? Trust in the person. That's just that trust in the person, and we need to get better and good and really good at that. But you know, challenge you to think about the trust in the other areas as well. So I want to thank you for having me here today. I always sort of like to try out my staff's speeches for me. I used page 6, if they're watching. All right. So anyway, thank you very much.
Well, that was everything it was cracked up to be and more. I think you'll agree with me on that. Gets us thinking about how we're doing business now, what we might be able to do with concepts of open data. It's really exciting to hear some real concrete examples of that. I'm sure it got a lot of your minds thinking about it. We're now going to move to a roundtable where I'm hoping for a lot more questions to be able to be asked. I've made the point with them, so we'll have to hold them to it. This next roundtable carries forward this theme of open data. It's about how common data format will change the structure of the voting industry, because we do believe it will. The moderator for the next session is David Weber. I invite the next session on. They should be coming in and marching past me here. David is the technical editor of the OASIS Election Markup Language, EML, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with hearing at least the term. But he also works as the NEEM information architect for Oracle. And although David is British, he does share a fascination with the strange world of American elections. He's uniquely qualified, in fact. He not only has a very broad perspective, that all of his positions afford him, but he actually personally developed the Virginia blank ballot delivery system. And you should watch out, David, because there are a lot of election officials here from Virginia, and if they're not happy, watch out for them after. Anyway, David's deeply involved with open data. He personally knows what the benefits are, but also what some of the downsides are. And apparently a very important point is that he's a member of Chess Masters, I was told. Anyway, we welcome David and his roundtable participants. We'll move the slide to them, and we're going to, invite you to be generous to the audience by allowing them time for questions as well as your own.
Yes,
Okay,
thank you, Susan. So you've just learnt some things about open data, is that you have hideous photographs of yourself out there, and of course Susan was able to easily find those. So we have a tremendous panel here, and I've had the pleasure of actually working with most of these gentlemen on one or two projects over the years. And they're all very insightful, so I'm raring to go here to get into hearing from them seeing what's going on with open data and common data formats and so on and so forth. I can see that Susan's super organized as usual and has all the their personal information and their affiliations and so on up there. So I'm going to skip over that and cut to the chase here in short order. So Susan mentioned open data and so on, and obviously Donna talked to you about NEAM. I'm also on the NEAM NTAC and contributing to that initiative as well. And we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years a realization that common data formats can really help improve a huge, across the board areas of voting and election management and so on. And that's a good thing. So now the challenge, of course, for the technical folks is to actually deliver on that. So we're working on that right now. And the world is also seeing this as well. I was earlier on the panel, the gentleman from Florida mentioned that, from the West Coast, Oregon, that's it. I was thinking Seattle. My US geography is not as good as everybody else's. That technology change in the last 50 years has been almost zero. And the last 5 years has been tremendous, and we're looking ahead to the next 5 years. So that's very much in my mind here. And of course, the White House has issued their information strategy on leveraging open data and these things called web-based interfaces for information sharing and interoperability. So there's a big push on this, and so let's see what our panel have to say on it. So the first question we're going to consider is how have you found that open common data standards contribute to effective information systems implementation, and can you relate your work to the needs for election systems and the utilization of common data format and open data? So John, you're with NIST, and that stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, so you guys must be on top of this, so you go first.
Right. Well, let's see, to answer that, so when the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002, the standard situation at that point was that I believe we had an older voting system standard that had been run by the NASED program. And it wasn't an effective, nationwide standard, and it didn't include anything about a common data format. And I think as a result, states had been for some time and continued to kind of invest all the new HAVA funds in stovepipe solutions, which effectively meant they had 1 or 2 vendors. And voting systems are supposed to last roughly 10 years, and they're all starting to get kind of old around that point. And people have become locked into these approaches because of the lack of a common data format. If they want to get the latest accessibility system that really suits their needs, they can't, or they can if they incur a fair amount of expense from rewriting interfaces. So a common data format opens up the market, helps them to essentially branch out, use the systems they want to use. An election official, when looking at which systems to buy, ought to be able to open up a catalog and look across many different manufacturers and say, I want that, and they all ought to work together seamlessly. So that's where we come in, and as you know from working together, in IEEE, that's what we're pushing towards.
Okay. Now, Duncan, I know the current initiative at IEEE and P1622 that we're working on as the US standards body to generate these common data format standards for folks. John mentioned the hardware side of it, but there's also this interoperability information sharing, and I know you have some personal experiences with this, both in being the original chair of the work and then from your own local jurisdiction work.
Well, yeah, we haven't, of course, used common data format in South Carolina. We do have in terms of my point of view, I have the advantage that we have one system statewide. So I can get, South Carolina declares the election data to be public record. So I have all of the election data. Last Monday night, I ran my programs on all of the data for, I think, 41 of the 46 counties. If I'd had to do this for 5 or 6 different vendors, formats, and hardware, it would be a much more difficult task. And I would get inconsistent results because not all the systems would produce the same kinds of output. The other advantage of having common data would be to start with the voter registration information and have that flow seamlessly to ballot definition, which is where we see a fair number of errors and mistakes and votes that don't get counted or have to be counted by hand because the software hasn't been configured properly. And then flowing outward, I know 3 years ago, Paul Stenborn talked about the media wanting things fast. Well, if you've got to aggregate results from multiple systems quickly at the end of a long day, it's going to be a lot easier if you have one format to write this tedious formatting code for in order to aggregate than many.
Yeah. And so, Greg, I know Susan was mentioning blank ballot delivery, and I know I worked with your team on using open source and open standards to deliver that Virginia solution. And obviously, we're very well aware that what Duncan was just talking about, when you're implementing these things and you're trying to do it and share people's information across all these different stovepipe systems that are out there, the lack of the common data format, how's that sort of impacting us and so on?
So, David, I think for the OSDV Foundation's Trust the Vote project, CDF is the mandate for us at the data layer, and there are several systems we're working on now. A new open source analytics system in the state of Virginia for voter information analytics. The election night reporting service that we just mentioned that we're building, that is on a CDF so that we have the ability to aggregate data, move it out quickly, expose an API to do that. And certainly P1622 and EML 310 and 330, the election markup language standards, using that again in the state of Virginia for elections administration. So we're actually getting an opportunity to literally put CDF into practice and seeing the benefit. And for us, with a highly componentized architecture of the overall framework that we're working on, where you have specific devices for specific purposes, having that data layer set up that way means that in an open source world, anyone can come in, get access to information. It really improves accountability loops. It makes for a whole new day in terms of verification and auditability.
Yeah. So, continuing on that thought, I see on the other side you have the Reuters, Washington Post, New York Times, here locally, Baltimore Sun, the media. And they have the reverse challenge, is that if they're going to be reporting this information, it really helps them to have a common data format that they're receiving this in. So they have to just build it once and then it works everywhere. And so segueing into, if all this wonderful information is floating around there, where do they put it?
Great. Well, first I'd like to thank you, David and Susan, for inviting me today. It's interesting, we're an infrastructure company, and just to give you a really quick view, I'm with Amazon Web Services. We're one of 3 businesses that Amazon.com has, the retailer, seller, and cloud computing business. And we're about providing infrastructure to enable what these gentlemen are talking about. So to enable innovation cycles, understanding the quality and improving the quality, getting access to infrastructure to be able to do that is key. Yeah. That's a key enabler.
I know we were talking earlier about a smaller municipality or a town or something. If they want to put information up there, in the past they had to buy computers, worry about security and all this, and these cloud services are really giving them the potential to do things which they just would never have even been able to contemplate before.
Yeah, in essence, what companies like Amazon are doing are we're providing compute power, storage, and we're making it ubiquitously available for use. And so we're really removing the undifferentiated heavy lifting of infrastructure and management when the business's goal may be OVF's mission to support voting and constructs and so forth. So you can really focus on the business, right, and not have to worry about the underlying.
Now I'm going to put you on the spot with the next question. because this all sounds wonderful. But as we know, in the last two election cycles, particularly the Obama campaign has been very open about how they've been able to use open data and public records of information. And so this thing can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If you start combining voter registration information with property records and other public sources of information that are available, you can start to build a really big, accurate picture of people, down to what their preference in breakfast cereal is, or what dreadful pictures they have of themselves out on the internet. So, what do the panelists think about all this, and how voters can leverage information themselves now to inform themselves and to do the reverse? So the campaigns are using all this information to target voters, but equally voters can find local communities of persons of interest and use the social media and these tools to actually work the other way around and say, hey, well, what about getting us a new local library, or if you want our votes, that kind of a thing. How do you think the infrastructure, how does that play out in the cloud?
It comes down to when we think about the cloud and how people use it, we want people to use best practices. We want people to use, and the cloud didn't invent good architecture and good design. And so I think that needs to be thought of in the cloud, on anywhere that you deploy your applications. So for us, we certainly support secure designs. We have over 300 government customers. We have 1,500 state and local customers. We have hundreds of thousands of customers in over 190 countries. So government entities, government organizations, commercial organizations to startups that are trusting their business in our platform. I think from our perspective, it comes down to how well they architect and design, how well the standards are implemented, how they're defined, and how they're and operationally how they're instituted. Right? Those are critically key things that didn't come to being because of the cloud.
Right.
Yeah.
So Duncan and Greg, sort of passing this over to you, I'm looking at the open source side of this now and saying, if you've got this open infrastructure, you have this open data, how does that present opportunities for tools like you were mentioning to be shared in, Duncan, and go first on this, in that way?
Well, I don't often say that South Carolina is a leader in things. But in terms of making the election data public, South Carolina certainly is a leader. They actually post all of the election data, which means that, and if this winds up in a common format, then it means that anybody becomes empowered with only a moderate expertise to be able to do this, not just the entities that have money. I have assigned large parts of the programs I have written to my second semester computer science students because there's some good data structure problems in there. And it's a way of civic engagement. They can actually see how many people voted for Steve Spurrier for governor, for example, or Ray Tanner, or Donald Duck, or Stephen Colbert. So I think the availability of the data, of the data in a format that everybody can understand, does empower smaller groups and other people to at least compete with the vested interests.
Yeah, so it's not just large commercial entities, and so Greg, I think that's been a big focus for your work as well, is providing tools to smaller jurisdictions that are open source and freely available that they can do these sorts of things with. So you can share some examples.
Well, sure, and I want to be clear that at the Trust the Vote project, we're really focused on election systems, administration systems, and voting systems. So there are a lot of great organizations out there like Sunlight Labs and Code for America that are taking advantage of these large repositories of data, slapping APIs on them and putting up gorgeous websites, data.gov, to get our rightful access to public information. So to the extent that there's public data out there that drives what we're doing, perhaps in the area of voter registration and some of the initiatives that we're working on there, I think have a play. But if I may, I want to take a little bit of a different spin on your question, because you talked about it being a double-edged sword, and I want to look at the other edge. So your employer owns a company that many of us know well and love now, Sun Microsystems. And many of us may recall that it was Scott McNealy who many years ago said, there is no privacy on the internet, get over it. And of course, we know that that launched a decade-long debate in the whole issue of privacy. And I think it's still raging today. I find, and I bet all of you do too, that the amount of care and diligence that's required to maintain a modicum of privacy today is alarming. Okay, I Googled my own mobile phone number the other day, and the results floored me, mostly due to my own inattention and my own lack of vigilance. I think another phenomena that we all have to pay attention to is that there's generations behind us that have a completely different take on what is the definition of privacy, and how they rely upon that or the lack thereof in their use of Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. That phenomenon is interesting because we've done a lot of research at the Trust the Vote project, mostly for UX, UI, user experience, user interface attributes of systems that we're working on. And what we discovered is that this new generation, those who are freshly registered to vote and who someday will be running our state houses, appear to be willing to trade privacy in order to gain transparency. In other words, if transparency was the issue, they'd be willingly give up their privacy to do so. And I think that's very telling. So as a result, there's two things that really bother me about what's going on with this big data and the ability to get to these stores. It has to do with what I call constituent intelligence, right? So I've got two proposals. One, and it takes a lot of political will to do this, but why isn't there a do not contact that applies to campaigns as well as it applies to marketers, right? I ought to have the ability to say, I need to be stopped harassing to death during campaign season with phone calls and emails for fundraisers. And the second half of that is really thinking about constituent relationship management, or believe it or not, CRM, but for a different C. Why shouldn't there be a database for each party that I, as a citizen voter, have access to with the ability to go fine-tune my preferences for privacy and how I'm contacted and when I'm contacted, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that within the parties, there is so much infighting over those databases that they won't agree. And to them, they're all different causes. Well, I have news for you. My local folks and then my regional folks and the federal government, it's still all one party to me reaching me. So I think that there's another side of this data issue that we need to look at, which is, yes, it's all accessible, and yes, there's CDFs out there and there's APIs, but what are we going to do about a privacy API or a privacy layer to manage that?
So you've segued into the next question all about security and brought up several interesting points there. So we all know that security is key to managing information. But what we're seeing here is that there's challenges for voters in being able to manage what's going on out there with the information. There's conflicts of interest in participation. I mean, this could be a complete turnoff. I know my own father, he adamantly refuses to give people information about himself, not even his address. You know, it's like, why do you need to know that? That's the opposite generation. So, John, we're going to start with you because I know security and all these aspects from NIST. What lessons are there out there? What insights and what future challenges are people looking at from the kind of research and NIST perspective?
Well, that's a big question and a lot of different answers. One thing I will mention is that a common data format used in voting systems is, in my opinion, kind of a foundational security mechanism. And one of the byproducts of its usage is that it makes systems more transparent. And I think that's a good thing. It lends more trust to electronic voting. When we want to do things on the internet, blank ballot distribution, if we're using a common data format and we've got a common log format, things of that sort, it's easier to understand the system. So, you know, that's one point. The other thing I'll mention that comes to mind in our work in IEEE as well is that we don't do anything currently about signing the records that come out of voting systems. They do need some protection. They need integrity protection, proof of origin protection. At a particular point, I think we need a PKI for voting systems. It doesn't have to be anything complex, but that is something we don't do currently, but I think it's, you know, coming down the bend.
Yes, yeah. So you maybe think of another aspect of this with the audit logs and the controls. I think it's really important. I know I've built systems for DHS, where specifically that was the key measure, that you could track who had accessed this and when and so forth. And that acts as a huge deterrent to abuse and misuse. So, Tim, over to you. How does that play into cloud services?
Sure. I have to admit, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record on the good architecture and design patterns that you follow. And from a standpoint of an infrastructure provider, we're interested in customers deploying best practices, security practices on our platform as a starting point. Thinking in terms of a building block, we're on individual servers and storage and so forth, and then the applications on top, of course, would employ other techniques. But data at rest encryption on storage volumes, number one, really big. Data in transit encryption, those are two keys, really key things. The thing that binds them together is the work that you're talking about, right, in the PKI. So we're committed as a vendor to support best practices in the fundamental infrastructure so that customers can deploy secure applications on our platform.
Yeah, so for me, of course, I understand all those buzzwords. I'm sure there's people out in the audience going, okay. So for me, it's like the entities that are using the platform shouldn't need to have to know about the mechanics of that. That stuff's going to be built in there. And it's maybe a checkbox or an option that they select for the type of service that they're requiring.
So I'll give you an example of what Amazon Web Services is doing. We have a storage service called S3, Simple Storage Service. And it's a place, it's a web object store. You can store files and stuff like that.
All my digital photos are stored up on it.
Right. And so one of the things that, thank you. So one of the things about that service is that when you store an object, you can select it is a check. I want to use AES 256-bit encryption. Sorry for the acronym, but that's a strong level of encryption for the data at rest storage. And so we're doing, as a cloud provider, we're listening to our customers and implementing these types of mechanisms to make it easy. Conversely, because we're fundamentally we're programmable infrastructure. That's why we're called web services. The people who build applications on top of our platform have all the instrumentation to ensure that the security in the infrastructure is tied to the security in the application and so forth.
So that's all the guts of it. What I'm seeing is that leveraging all this, there's a huge information sharing potential here for voters. So particularly if you're overseas, you might not have visibility and touch into the community that you would expect if you were living there. So things like history of bills that have been passed, referendum manifestos, party positions, all that sort of stuff, where if I, say, had moved here from Maryland down to Richmond and I was going to vote in a local election there and say, well, who are these candidates? What's been going on here? Who would I support? That's the sort of thing that we could see people being able to reach out to. And also things like citizen census demographics, so you can understand who the rest of the people are that you're voting with. So, Greg, I'll go back to you on this. What experience do you have, and what are you seeing in this sort of area there?
So, at least for us, I go back to this notion that we spoke of earlier about the notion that CDFs and the data layer are absolutely essential. We're very partial to the notion that if I know how to cast a ballot and I know how to register to vote in New York and I decide to move to California, that I ought to be able to look at things and say, this is pretty good. I've seen this before. I know how to do this, right? Our hope, our aspiration with the work that we're doing is that by putting blueprints and proposed standards out there for how that might work, that it'll become easy to adopt, adapt, and deploy in each jurisdiction, that over time we might work towards a homogenization of some of these things for the betterment of the system. At least that's our laudable goal.
Yes. And you've reminded me as well, in the common data format, we're not just talking about like voter records and things like that. We also have standards in there for candidates and ballot issues and so on, which help formalize this. So, Duncan, I know you were talking earlier about the vote records being put up online. What are the challenges? What are you seeing for South Carolina doing more of this with this other election information?
I think it's hard to say what's going to happen. The cast vote records go up, the audit logs go up, such as they are. The results are up there. They're all available. My suspicion is that it may stop there, but that's partly because we have a very decentralized election process, which I think is also partly a caution about all of these security issues. It's not at all clear to me that in each of the 46 counties we have people who would know how to check off these boxes appropriately. I mean, as an academic, one of the things we always tout is that there are more jobs per graduate in computer science than almost anything else. And there always have been. So as long as there aren't enough computer scientists to go around, they may not wind up at county election offices in rural counties. I think we have some I've heard from places that do things right. I know that we don't always do it as right in South Carolina, and I suspect we're not unique in this regard. So I would certainly like to see more of this information up there and available. I think the ability to make all of this information transparent with the geographic information systems that come from county records and the demographics merged in with the voting data will make it possible for citizens to really know what's going on, and I think that would be a good thing.
Yes, yeah. We saw earlier the panelists from Georgia were sharing, the voting maps and the color coding of, and that's all these visuals are great.
I had an undergraduate come to me day before yesterday to say, I just learned how to do interactive maps. I want to do it with your vote data. So we'll do some precinct maps for Richland County.
Yes, and the more we can get these tools out there, the more these become open source resources, the more other people can take it and then just apply it to their.
And I have to put in a plug for open source because as an academic, it's a lot easier if the big package is already mostly there because student work cannot be finished in 15 weeks and do anything as complicated as an election system.
Right, yes, yeah. John, any thoughts on this?
Well, open source, I'd put a plug in for that as well. What we're doing with the Common Data Format is enabling open source as well as small businesses and opening up the market in general. Mm-hmm. And I think in general that's a good thing, and empowers citizens to be able to it's a format that everybody will be able to access and use. And the other thing mentioned about putting up cast vote records. So one of the issues is with a common data format, you can make all this information available, and there is a reluctance in a number of states to, for example, put cast vote records, make those available, electronic versions. And while I think it's important to be able to, in our format, if one wanted to, be able to trace everything back to specific machines and for the purposes of audit at the same time, we have to build in proper anonymization techniques as well. Because I do think for making audits easier, it would be a good idea to have a lot of cast vote records available and be able to link them back to the, if there's a paper record that they link back to. But at the same time, it has to be done in a way that isn't going to isn't going to make someone feel as if someone can figure out where they voted.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I think that's very important. And I know the work that we're doing currently with IEEE P1622 to do this EML 520 for election night reporting. We're very sensitive to that. And we're seeing that really that you've got two formats. One that allows the media to get those aggregated pieces of information and report it down to the local towns or whatever. But at the same time, there's been some anonymization and roll-up happening, so you don't expose in those outlying areas where there's only 5 or 10 voters what's going on there. Right. And so it's a different role for the common data format to be able to do that, as opposed to provide researchers the ability to audit and control, and look in depth at what's happened.
But this also is a standard statistical problem that exists in healthcare data as well. You shouldn't be able to ask questions so specific they narrow it down to one person.
Yeah.
If I may,
absolutely.
Add a pattern here a little bit. I like to think in terms of sort of corollaries, not necessarily open data format discussion, but if you look at what Health and Human Services is doing with the 1,000 genome data set, it's about 250 gigabyte. They're very public about this, and they've posted it up on our platform. And they allow the reason they've done this, and we've done this through partnership, is that they want to allow researchers worldwide to be able to look at that genome set, which isn't identifiable to an individual, and discover cures. Yeah. And so the big problem that they had was getting the data put together in a place, and a platform that people could actually get access to. Yeah. Okay.
So last question here is kind of a blue sky, forward-thinking one, is that from your experiences, if you had to pick just one technology aspect where the potential for innovation and so on can really improve voter experience and encourage citizen engagement and all these good things that we want to have with our election processes, what are you seeing as things coming down the pike here? So Greg, I'm going to go with you first.
Right, so I think the thing that struck us the most in the past 10 to 12 months has been the rise of unstructured data spaces, very, very large databases. Most of the big websites today are being run with these new so-called no SQL data spaces. And I think examples are Mongo, Cassandra, Hadoop is another great one. What has happened is that has now driven a whole new generation of analytics tool makers, folks like Mixpanel and others, who have figured out how to take an unstructured data space, no SQL, and apply the same sorts of tools that you would in the relational world. Now, the reason I think this is a huge innovation for us is that building relational data models, my wife runs a company in customer intelligence, and they build nothing but huge marketing databases for Nike and whatnot. And that's a big job with a big ticket to get in. Just the whole design of an RDBMS, right? So these new data spaces allow you to just start throwing stuff into this big container and then figure out how to manage it later. Yeah. That is going to allow us to continue this trend, I think, within the internet space, the so-called big data, the ability to longitudinally grab enormous amounts of data and then put analytics against it.
So I'm thinking earlier, the lady from Albuquerque was saying we figured out if we opened the early voting places at 8 o'clock in the morning, we got more voters. And right. That's the sort of thing that you will be able to go in and look at.
Exactly, longitudinally.
Commuter patterns and say, yeah, here's where you need to put your polling place and here's when you need to open it. So, Duncan.
I guess my biggest technology innovation would be the one that isn't going to happen, and that is that I don't think that computer security is going to advance anywhere near as fast as people who are involved in policy are likely to want to drive it, which means I think we need to be extraordinarily skeptical about anything that goes over the internet. Because nothing that goes over the internet can be trusted, period. And it's not likely to be trustable for another 10 or 20 years.
Right. Yeah.
And unless you want everybody in...
Well, what I see is that for voting purposes, it's a two-way trust thing. It's not like your bank account or ordering using PayPal or going on eBay. The election officials have to validate that you are the person that they have registered, and then conversely, you have to vote anonymously the other way around, and that's a big, big challenge.
Yeah, people have asked me a lot about the comparison of a machine with an ATM, and it's not really an ATM that we compare it to. It's really more like a slot machine in Vegas. The only reason that we put money in the machine expecting to get anything out ever is because somebody in the background did some vetting, we hope, on the software inside the machines. Yeah. Otherwise, it's 100% certainty that the money is lost. And right. I think computer security is just hard, and software is hard. And what's even harder is explaining the details to the lay public so they really understand what's going on in the computer system.
Well,
and for voting, I think that's very important.
That's the point. And you made this point earlier, and I think it needs to be reemphasized. You know, we learned a hard lesson at Netscape years ago about how not to try to do that, right? You made the point earlier about security has got to be consumer ready and consumer ingestible. It's not that there aren't things out there that we could do. I mean, those of us who are at large companies carry around little secure ID cards and with little numbers that get generated every 59 seconds. And there are things you can do to improve that. But public key infrastructure, PKI, great idea. But the idea of reducing that to something that's consumer ready, that's what I think is a decade or more away. Because, I mean, we tried it years ago, and it turned out to be a nightmare.
So, Tim, what magic goodies has Amazon got in its bag?
I'm going to politely break the rules a little bit because I want to comment on a couple things. So I think that in order to solve the, for security to catch up to policy, is that we need to innovate. And so as an infrastructure platform provider, we want to provide ubiquitous access to resources. It's the innovator's dilemma. You try something 9 times, the 10th time you win. And you make it, right? And the challenge is you need to be able to fail fast.
Yeah.
Right. So you need to be able to get what you need and then fail fast. Think of things in fungible terms. Right?
Unfortunately, those are
increase innovation cycles to keep up with this. Now, the other aspect that I wanted to key on that Greg mentioned was Hadoop as an example, or parallel processing. How do you deal with all this unstructured data? You know, the trend is take the data, the code to the data, right? And so the notion is, instead of thinking about the questions I want to ask ahead of time, I'm gonna keep asking questions until I get what I want. Instead of in security we call this signature-based analysis, but it's also very effective to look at patterns in data sets. And so, like with Amazon Web Services, we have a hosted Hadoop platform called Elastic MapReduce. Customers have launched over 4 million Hadoop clusters on our platform since its inception a couple years ago. So we're seeing a lot of uptick in that interest in this area.
I like the innovation side of it. I know because when S3 first went up there, I was like, what the heck's this? Sure. And then I discovered that my digital photography site was using it, and it's like, oh, that's really cool. So that was something being used in a way you hadn't thought of, and I think that's definitely there in the election space. But of course, they're super conservative, and so the innovative fail, and then
you can't afford to fail fast in elections.
It's probably not a good model.
I mean, Tim, that's the only thing. You can't afford to fail fast in elections.
Right.
Yes,
right. So elections are fault intolerant.
Right.
Sure. So we need to figure out ways to prove models. And then find a safe and sane way to apply them.
Right. You betcha. So in production, so the innovator's dilemma is leading up to a production operational environment.
But on the other hand, Duncan, you're showing that, hey, South Carolina puts all their data up there, and good things happen, and so there's kind of a to and fro on that.
I mean, the output goes there. It's just the anonymity. And you can't afford to fail fast. I grew up in the space program, and my father explained to me. My father studied rockets from Von Braun, literally, and he explained to me, beyond about T-7 seconds, you're committed. The missile is going to go up, whether you want it to or not. And elections work the same way. They absolutely have to work, early voting or no. They have to work.
Right.
And we have as big a problem with corruption as we do with disruption, where we get a result that we don't necessarily trust, and then we have to deal with it. And I think that's not the place where we want to
That's a perfect segue for you, John. And so what do you see here?
I guess I'd like to mention 2 things. One is, with regard to the discussion of trusting systems. Again, I see a common data format fundamentally making systems more trustable, making them easier to test. With common interfaces. So that's an important thing. The other technological challenge is not really a technological challenge, but one of the goals we have is being able to produce kind of a ballot definition, a generic ballot definition that would work on any voting device. And we see people interested in using iPads and other sorts of mobile devices for filling out a ballot, and smaller real estate. And putting all the state-specific details, all the font sizes and layout and everything into a common data format is a very big challenge. But I do see that when you're dealing with a smaller device and you have less real estate, you can have more, potentially more simplified, more usable ballots. And, you know, sort of ironically or conveniently, it also makes it much easier to do in a common data format. The big challenge there is, will states allow that, you know, because they have laws and procedures. But I think it, you know, I like the fact that that might lead to simplified ballots and thus make them easier to understand.
Right. But I think also the production process, I think what I see is that the common data format is about the information that goes on to the ballot. Who are the candidates, who are the officers, and what are the resolutions issues and so on. The other piece that goes with that is then the rendering. How do I take this information and put it on that iPad, or put it on this PDF that I'm going to email to somebody, or put it on this piece of paper? So I think those are two different problems.
Right.
And people tend to muddy them together. So I think that we need the common data format for the ballot information will be hugely positive. I know when we did the blank ballot delivery for Virginia, people spent 2 weeks eyeballing pieces of paper to make sure that is craziness. Yep. And we know we can automate that. We know we can create batch scripts.
We're reserving 5 minutes for the audience.
Great. Perfect timing.
We'll get closer to being on time.
All right, Susan.
Great. We got a couple runners with mics. Great. You get to call out who gets first.
Oh, I can't see anybody. All I can see is spotlights. So, we'll take this gentleman over here then.
Yes, the Help America Vote Act of 2002 recommended, unfortunately did not require, that every state centralize at the state government level the administration of absentee voting, at least for UOCAVA voters. I understand only one state, Maine, has implemented that suggestion, and Alaska has always done it centrally. But 48 states, it's done by counties, towns. There's 7,500 election officials for federal elections. If we could go from 7,500 to 55, wouldn't that make a lot of these problems you're talking about immensely easier?
Yes, and obviously a common data format and being able to aggregate the information about ballots, ballot delivery, who's registered to vote, and so on is all a huge part of that. John, I think you probably know closest to this.
I feel like I just repeat things I've said before. Where I work is primarily in getting devices to talk to each other. And so obviously that leads to things such as making ballots available in a more widespread fashion, in a better way. I think maybe some of these other gentlemen could take it to a different level.
Yeah, Greg.
The only thing I would add is if you can do it for 55, you can do it for 7,500. Will CDFs allow people to reduce the number of people? I think actually it makes it easier to sustain what you have. I think since elections are, and we know this well from 6 years of study, they're such a local thing. They're so balkanized, if you will, that the whole point of things like CDF and open standards is to make it possible that there's more people can access that and do more things with it.
Yeah, and I know when we did the blank ballot delivery, I was telling Susan earlier, I had somebody call me from Australia, and it came through to my cell phone as I was driving in Old Town Alexandria, and he said, I can't get the system to accept my name, and I know it's in there. Right. You know, so I think the local touch is really important. Yeah. But the lesson learned there was that the data quality, the data that were being keyed in, somebody put an asterisk instead of a hyphen.
Yep.
So, you know, by standardizing these things and bringing them up statewide, you can eliminate these silly snafus to a large extent, but you still want to, you know, that person to be able to call their local office and say, hey, you know, I've looked online and I can't see my name, what's going on?
One of the things we constantly have to watch for is that, yes, standards are great. Standards can also be constraining. There has got to be some reasonable flexibility. Why is it that some sites I can go to, I put in dot number for my phone number because that's what we use now, and it coughs, and I realize, oh, it still wants the dash.
Yeah. So, another question. Are you offering here? Good. We'll take this lady here.
I'm a little bit afraid to ask it, though, because I'm a Colorado voter living in Austria and being back in the U.S. this week. Vicky's here from Luxembourg, too. You spend a lot of time eavesdropping English conversations because I'm in a German environment most of the time. And for some of this presentation, I felt like you weren't speaking my language. But here's my question. Earlier today, we talked about the return of voted ballots from overseas by post, by fax, by email. Are you telling us after this discussion we should not be looking at electronic voting?
I will say that. I don't know what the rest would.
Okay, well, my German's not that good, so I'm going to have to keep going in English. I only speak schoolboy German, and it's terrible. What I see, though, having done that blank ballot delivery system for Virginia, is there's a big difference between delivering those blank ballots and somebody downloading that and then printing it off and having that convenience and then being able to send that back, as to doing a full internet voting system.
Right.
Because physically there's a separation. Okay? You have to print it off, and a human has to be involved in that. As soon as you fully automate it, then all kinds of other things come into play. And so that's what we're talking about. You know, how do you know that this isn't somebody in Shanghai, China, voting for somebody in Virginia? See, and so that's just one small piece of it. So yeah, we fully understand the convenience factor, but you still have to have the human part currently to mitigate, these potential
Let me
issues.
expand on my comment. Yes, it is possible to take a PDF file on a computer and encrypt it and send it back and have it decrypted and know that it was transmitted securely. Is that a consumer-ready process for J-random voter anywhere in the world? I don't think so. And that, I think, is part of the problem. And I don't think if you try to generalize to make it consumer-ready, we're not there yet technologically. Right. We may not be there yet for a very long time.
And the other aspect of this I'm just thinking about is that I don't think the voting infrastructure is there mature yet. We're talking about, first of all, we need this common data format. That's crucial, I think, to get to the level of confidence that the current system works reliably, consistently. Because, we heard earlier about all these issues with people just showing up at a polling place and expecting to vote, and then they have to do a provisional ballot, and did we get them the right ballot format, and all these just mechanical pieces of it that, as Duncan was saying, if you're aware and you're sophisticated, you may be able to mitigate all that, but if you're not, then this is a challenge. So there's a lot of moving parts.
My esteemed colleague here, I'm going to dissent with him in part to the extent that I think it's important that we understand when we say e-voting, right? So the use of computers in elections is unfortunately here to stay based on the sheer volume of data we have to manage. The responsible use is the question. If you're talking about things like voting online, we're in complete concurrence. No. But I don't think anybody here said today that we should be saying e-voting isn't going to happen. What we're saying is that the use of computers, we have to manage how we're using them. Because as to your point, yes, we may be able to nail down this process. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And then that's only one process, right? Then we have to secure the cloud, which inherently can't be done under today's structure in a way that's consumer ready for J-random voter. For businesses and commercial enterprises relying on the cloud, absolutely. But I think it gets to be a different question when you're talking about a consumer.
It's interesting because what you're really talking about here is we haven't figured out how to innovate enough in order to provide to the consumer. And so, from our perspective, we're providing resources to be able to do that, so that the other computer scientists, not everybody, right, but the people who do build software for the ecosystem here can do that, and it gets access, and we can overcome that innovator's dilemma.
And then, as John and I know, when working with all the standards bodies and that, people have to vet it, they have to be validate it, and then it has to be accepted, and then it has to be legislated. So there's a lot of distance to go from where we are. Yeah. Susan.
Unfortunately, we're running kind of behind, so
okay.
I think that was a great question to end on.
Okay.
And thank you so much. This was very illuminating. Some of it was in English. Thank you. We learned a lot. We learned a lot. So I'll ask you to exit stage right or left, whichever you prefer. And Alex, if you could bring another chair up for the following roundtable. But we'll be first stopping by with Secretary of State Allison Lundergan Grimes, Kentucky. Now, some of you may not know, but Kentucky is a state with a solid history of working with OVF. We worked with the Kentucky Secretary of State's office to launch a customized state-hosted system for them in 2008. And in 2012, the Kentucky system supported over 5,500 voters, overseas and military voters, specifically to register and request ballots. Allison Lundergan Grimes is Kentucky's 76th Secretary of State. She's also the youngest female Secretary of State nationwide. Secretary Grimes is dedicated to protecting all eligible Kentuckians' voting rights, but especially those of the men and women in uniform and veterans. Last September, she traveled to the Middle East, to several countries there, and was deeply affected by this experience, which resulted in her introduction of several new legislative proposals. We're very pleased to introduce Secretary Grimes today, and I hope she's standing in the wings. Great. For our panelists following Secretary Grimes, make sure to get your mics on. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a good afternoon, and it's great to be here. I want to thank Susan for the kind introduction and OVF for inviting me to be here to be a speaker at the 7th Annual OVF Summit. Imagine with me, if you all will, traveling for 15 hours. Not that any of you have ever done that. 15 hours. Nearly 8,000 miles to the Middle East, to be greeted by men and women in uniform who are collectively engaged in defending this United States, seeing many men and women from my state of Kentucky, upon having the opportunity to thank them for their selfless service, for their sacrifice, encouraging them to vote in the November election, and most importantly, to send their vote back home, only to be asked, does my vote actually count? Unfortunately, this is the one repeated question that I received from our nation's heroes on the front line in the Middle East. I'm Allison Lundergan Grimes, Kentucky's Secretary of State, and I'm honored to be here with you today to discuss efforts that I have undertaken in Kentucky, in our Commonwealth, to improve access to the ballot box for all eligible Kentuckians, most importantly, for the men and women that protect that right. Early last year, the Military Voter Protection Project, they praised 15 states for their efforts to protect America's military members. 3 of the 15 states border Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia. Natalie Tennant, Secretary of State, is with us here today. And Indiana, Secretary of State Connie Lawson. Sadly, for Kentucky's heroes, Kentucky was not on that list. That's why we are here today. This must change. And today is a historic day. It's not only the 7th Annual OVF Summit, but we just heard an announcement from the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, which lifts the ban on women in combat. His comments just a few moments ago at his press conference are symbolic for us here today. He said not everyone has the opportunity to be a combat soldier, but everyone should be given the chance. And that is what I, as chief election official, as Secretary of State, as the election administrators that with us here today are all about. It's about making sure that all eligible citizens, especially those that are fighting for that right, have the chance, the meaningful chance to participate in our elections. I know each of you shares in my commitment. The commitment to make sure that our nation's heroes don't have to compromise their right to vote while they are abroad protecting ours. And it is truly an honor and a privilege to be here with you today, to come together and to share our ideas, our experiences as to how we are going to work to protect the privileges of citizenship, which it truly is a privilege in the United States, the privileges of citizenship that so many Americans dedicate their lives to fighting for. Where are we? What are the stats right now? We've heard many of them, but it's important to know how far we have come. In 2010, as many as 1/3 of our military and overseas voters did not have the opportunity to participate in an election because their absentee ballot either never arrived or, worse, arrived too late. That's actually a substantial improvement from where we were in 2008, with that number of Americans who were disenfranchised as high as 50%. I think we all agree this is a problem. For me especially, it's the words that I hear from a mother of a frontline soldier who's from Paducah, Kentucky. Her son is stationed in Iraq, has been in Afghanistan and Kuwait. She wrote to me just last week, and her comments were, "Secretary, Kentucky has a great system to get ballots to our soldiers. But I have to tell you, not once has my son or my brother-in-law been able to get their ballot back in time to be counted." Her question to me, these soldiers are fighting for that very right that we give to people. Are we not going to fight for them? I know the secretaries that are here have received similar messages, and the comments of Ms. Dickey echo in my mind daily. Voting, to me, it's the foundation of our democracy. Our system of government depends and succeeds only when everyone has the ability to meaningfully participate in our elections. This means the ability to cast a ballot that will actually be counted. As Kentucky's Secretary of State, protecting the voices of all eligible Kentucky citizens, especially the thousands of men and women in our military, is a priority. Kentucky has a privilege of being the home to 2 military bases, Fort Knox and Fort Campbell. And to that end, as chief election official, I have worked to make sure that we are keeping the lines of communication open to our active duty and our veteran military members to understand the challenges they face while abroad as well as when they come home. I've met with the service members at both Fort Knox and Fort Campbell, educating them about the options, about how to register to vote, how to request an absentee ballot, how to receive it, and most importantly, how to transmit that ballot back to their county election official. But I have to tell you, the most important education was my own. It is what I learned from them. Simply recognizing the fact that members of our military weren't receiving their absentee ballots or able to get it back timely enough is not enough. I believe to efficiently and effectively understand and address the problems that our members of the military and overseas voters are facing, we have to have an understanding of its roots. To this end, when I met with our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our National Guard, I actually did more listening, if it's hard to believe from an elected official, than talking. I listened to what they were doing, where they were going, and most importantly, how they communicated with their family back home. This past September of 2012, I had the honor to be invited by the Department of Defense along with 4 other Secretaries of State. Secretary of State Ruth Johnson from Michigan, Ross Miller from Nevada, Tom Shedler from Louisiana, and Mark Martin from my southern state of Arkansas, to travel to the Middle East, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, to visit with our members of the military and overseas voters, and to assess firsthand and to make improvements to our military and overseas voting procedures. This opportunity allowed me the chance to say thank you. Thank you to the selfless sacrifice that our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Marine, our Coast Guard, and National Guard make on a daily basis to give us the ability and the chance to vote here in the United States. We were able to assess firsthand the obstacles and risks that each of these individuals face in exercising their fundamental right to vote. Each service member that I spoke with, that I had the opportunity to meet, their first comments were never about the work that they were doing, but rather about their family and friends that are making the unbelievable sacrifice back here at home. Our military members, they represent the best of Kentucky. They represent the best of the United States. They are about pride, honor, duty, sacrifice, and most importantly, love of freedom. And they deserve, from their elected officials, the best. As you all know, and we've heard today and the panel before us, there have been developments in federal law that have worked to provide greater protection for our members of the military, their ability to register to vote and send that vote back home. And as I toured military mail facilities, talked with the numerous voting assistance officers that are in the Middle East, I saw the great care that was taken to ensure the integrity of our election process. In theater, I can tell you, I saw and heard firsthand from our members that are in the military that our ballots really do go with the beans and the bullets and transportation of the assets. But I also saw firsthand the obstacles that remain to our military members and our overseas voters in exercising their right to vote. Take, for instance, the thousands of non-military personnel that are overseas, residing in the Middle East, registering to vote and transmitting that ballot back here to the United States is burdensome. Mail, I discovered, is not reliable in the Middle East. Faxes cannot be sent internationally, especially to 1-800 numbers, and security concerns, as we visited each of the embassies, limit the ability that the embassies have to do and conduct voter outreach efforts. These problems are only compounded for our men and women in military service. Mail is not efficient, with sometimes delays of weeks before a ballot actually reaches the voter. Members of the military are constantly on the move, and keeping up with them and locating them is a challenge. Fax machines, despite what we might believe, are not available, especially on all of our forward operating bases. And absentee registration and voting laws, as we all know, vary from state to state, complicating the duty and task that is before our voting assistance officers and the men and women in uniform who are trying to navigate them to have their voice heard. As the President in his inaugural address this past week rightly noted, we as a nation have an obligation to implement real solutions to these problems, and we cannot afford to waste time in providing that help. To that end, what I heard while I was in the Middle East from numerous members of the military and our overseas voters was the need and desire and want for increased automation and, yes, for consistency. In Kentucky, I have made several recommendations, the first of which I believe and have recommended that Kentucky implement online voter registration for our military and overseas voters. Over 15 states are currently offering paperless voter registration, and it is having and producing great successful results, saving our counties and the states both time and money. Using the security measures that I saw firsthand that are available and already in use by our Department of Homeland Security, by the State Department, and yes, the IRS, online voter registration is a viable option, and we must explore it. Secondly, I believe that our election laws, they must permit sufficient time for our military and overseas voters to actually participate in all elections, not just federal elections. Upon being asked, does my vote actually count, I would talk with our service man or woman and tell them, yes, as Secretary of State, chief election official for the Commonwealth, your vote does count. You are a priority. After all, the right to vote is meaningless if your vote is never counted. But each of the servicemen and women that I encountered rightly recalled a 2000 presidential election where thousands of military ballots were never counted. And of course, the requirements that we place on them additionally, deadlines, postmarks, transmission methods, in order for a ballot to be valid, these are requirements that are daunting to our service members. We must preserve the integrity of our elections. We must work to alleviate the constraints that we have placed on our military and overseas voters. It can take up to 45 days for a ballot to be requested, received, filled out, and transmitted back to the United States. And although the MOVE Act has taken us a long way, giving us sufficient time in federal elections for ballots to actually get to our military and overseas voters, the same law does not apply to our state elections, meaning our military and overseas voters simply do not have enough time to cast a vote for those people that will represent them when they come home at the local level in state and county elections. For example, in Kentucky, for a special election, the earliest that we can transmit a ballot based on the current law and the filing deadlines is 27 days before the election. Last summer, I challenged this law in state court and successfully obtained an order based on 3 special elections that we had so that we were able to send our ballots 45 days in advance. But Kentucky is not the only one with this problem. I recognize that many of you that are here today, that many other states face this same obstacle, and we must find a permanent solution. Our laws must respect and provide our military and overseas voters the opportunity to participate in all elections. Every election matters and every vote counts, especially our men and women in service. Thirdly, I believe and have recommended that Kentucky consider permitting military and overseas voters to return their executed ballot back via email. Over 24 states are currently successfully doing this. I heard repeatedly from our military men and women that email was the most successful and best use to communicate with an overseas soldier. Our laws have to and must take into account the obstacles that our men and women in uniform and overseas voters face and look out to available technology to meet those needs. Our military is on the move, and we have the obligation to keep up with them. I believe with the available security measures that I saw firsthand, we can implement this in the state of Kentucky while protecting the integrity of our election. We must, can, and should do this. Facing unique and often very harsh circumstances, lastly, I believe that our voters have a difficult time in the military and overseas in actually returning their ballot timely to the United States. Take, for instance, the statistics in Kentucky. We issued over 1,700 absentee ballots for overseas voters. Approximately 1,300 of those ballots actually returned and counted, but 61, one too many, had to be rejected by our county clerks because they were not timely received by 6 p.m. on Election Day. Our law should acknowledge the fact and permit ballots to be counted so long as assurances such as a voter verification is executed on the ballot so that we can allow our military men and women to have their voice heard on Election Day. The Uniform Military and Overseas Vote Act, UMUVA, it provides a good starting point for this in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that we are looking towards for achieving the objective of making sure that as long as that voter assurance is there, that the vote is cast prior to Election Day, it will be counted in the state of Kentucky. Since 2010, over 10 states have enacted UMUVA successfully. UMUVA extends, importantly, the protections that we find in federal law to state law, as well as to the National Guard, the thousands of National Guardsmen that Kentucky has currently serving in the Middle East. Having consistent laws throughout the United States will likewise achieve the goal set by our military members. It will help facilitate our voting assistance officers who are trying to navigate their way through the various state laws, as well as the men and women who deserve to have their voice heard. These recommendations that I've set forth, they've been received with bipartisan support in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Indeed, the President of the Senate, a Republican, President Stivers, has taken these on and has included these recommendations in his Senate Bill 1, known as Kentucky Heroes Voting Initiative. This bill, with the important designation of SB 1, will receive, as it should and our military men and women and overseas voters deserve, the priority of being heard in Kentucky's Senate first, and hopefully in the House passing as well. SB 1 will, it is my hope, move our military and overseas voters from the back of the line to the front of the line, from the bottom of the list to the top of every military voter protection list. That is what we can and must and should do. I'm here today to encourage each of you to do the same for your states. I encourage you, you're here today because you want to be part of the conversation. Continue in that effort and reach out to your secretaries of state. In Kentucky, we're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. I hope you're tweeting us right now at KYSecOfState. You can go to our website at sos.ky.gov and find a copy of the report regarding the recommendations I'm speaking of today. You can also view, and I would encourage you to look at, the joint report that 5 secretaries of state issued in conjunction with their trip last year to the Middle East. I urge you to learn from our experiences, learn from your own experiences, and tailor solutions to the problems that we face in your state that will work, so that we can ensure that no military member ever has to ask the question whether their vote counts. This 7th OVF Summit, it's about expanding the conversation. And if there's one message I'm here to tell you today, it's to be open to expanding your own knowledge. I was, and I have been changed for the better because of it, and hopefully we will make progress in the state of Kentucky for our military and overseas voters. What is at stake, what I saw firsthand that's at stake, especially in the Middle East for those that are fighting for us, it is too great for us to turn our heads and to ignore. In Kentucky, we encourage the electorate to go out and vote on Election Day in honor of our veterans. We have a Vote in Honor of a Veteran program, buttons that I've brought for each of you to share here today, and secretaries of state across the nation that I know have similar or same programs. I can tell you that I, as Secretary of State, endorse this program and am proud of it because the men and women in our military, whom I had the privilege and honor to meet, to get to know, and to continue to have conversations with as we move through this legislation in Kentucky, they not only represent the best of Kentucky and the United States, but when they put their uniform on, they set partisanship aside, and they fight for one United States. In Kentucky, across the Commonwealth, we must do the same. We must do the same and fight for them. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to talking with you after the session. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a very moving speech, something quite unique. That energy is incredible. So it's really perfect to lead us into the military roundtable because, in fact, this topic is so passionate. It's as passionate as Secretary Grimes put it forth. The military roundtable has become really quite a tradition at the OVF Summit, and this year we're really proud to bring in a whole new lineup of people. One thing that has changed in the agenda, however, is that our moderator didn't make it. So you're stuck with yours truly. I'll be standing in for Patrick Hale. Bear with me, but I think I know and love this topic as much as all of you. Our participants, I'll start by introducing Laura Dietz. She's a former congressional staffer and is working in her NGO capacity at Camp Pendleton to bring Marines into the voting process. Dr. Donald S. Inbody in the middle there is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science in Texas State University, excuse me. He's a former Navy captain and an expert in civil-military relations. Eric Eversole is president of the Military Voter Protection Project. It's all in the name right there. And he has great experience coming from the voting section of the U.S. DOJ Civil Rights Division. David Byrne, acting director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program in their technology program section. There is no UOCAVA discussion that's complete without the FEAP present, but this is great with David here as he knows their technology inside and out. And Paul Herndsen, who's at the end there, is a late addition to the list. He's not in the program. Paul is a renowned scholar of American politics from the University of Maryland and the director of the Center for American Politics there. If someone would be so kind to bring me some water, that would be great. Perhaps Alex. I'm going to sit down here and we're going to have to switch mics. Hello? Okay. If this doesn't work. I'm going to start right in with our panel, asking them to address the MOVE Act and how they feel the implementation has gone and whether it's been effective. I think most of the people in this audience know what the MOVE Act is. Dare I summarize it? The four main provisions were that it required a 45-day ballot transmission window prior to Election Day. It annihilated any requirements for notarization, although we did find out that even though witnessing wasn't promoted, it could be requested. So it didn't annihilate completely the fact that states could request witnesses on ballots, but it did slow it down a little bit. It also mandated that online assistance should be provided. It didn't say specifically what kind of online assistance, but that some assistance online for voter registration and ballot request, FPCAs we call them, should be online. And it does mandate for an option for electronic blank ballot transmission to the voter. They could still get by post if they want it, but they should be allowed to choose. So those were sort of four main provisions. States went about it. Some states had a head start, some states didn't, but all of the states have gotten really readily involved in this. Now I want to break the ice and hand it over to these guys because you've heard enough from me. But I'd like you each to very quickly, no dragging on, rate the MOVE Act between 1 and 10, with 10 the highest, where you think we are, and tell me why, tell them why, and hand over to the next. So we'll just start over there with Paul. If you want to pass on this one, because you may not know, just let me know. Do you want to pass on this one?
No, I'll just jump right in.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. So I rate the MOVE Act between 6 or 7, and that's not very far below where I rate domestic elections in the United States in general. And the reasons are, first, implementation. Something was actually implemented in every state and territory. Second, voter registration. That I did not rate very highly. I think there are still problems. Then the other criteria I looked at was usability. How easy are these different systems that people that want to vote from abroad or in the military to use? And it's a mixed bag. Somewhere from 5 to 8, 5 to 9, depending on the state. Beyond usability, how many people are using the new electronic systems that were mandated in the MOVE Act? And there, I rated it pretty high because there has been a large number, 8 or 9. Beyond that, a big part of getting people to use any new voting system or anything new at all has to do with education and communications and outreach. And I don't want to use the word stink per se, but my lowest rating is in that regard. And then finally, there are special populations that the MOVE Act was intended to address. There are differences between military voters that are domestically located and abroad. that are in conflict zones and aren't, that are located in allied countries or not. And I've done some research on that, and I think there's a lot of work to do there. So those criteria bring me around 6 or 7, which is not far below the way I rate our overall election system.
Okay, so Paul's at 6.5. And we'll pass the baton to Laura.
Well, I'm going to give a 5, but I'm going to narrow my comments to the part that I was really involved in, and that was talking to Marines, their dependents, specifically about how much they knew about FVAP, if they knew about it at all. Most of them did not know anything about it. Most of them did not know who their VAO was. And quite frankly, if you hand a Marine a collateral duty that requires him to understand 370 pages of this book and a stack of forms about a process that even most civilians don't understand, I think there's a problem. And so I approached it having registered civilians for years and having studied what FVAP was all about and how to do it. I have firsthand knowledge about the responses. They included, I didn't know what to do. My husband and I were talking about the other night, but you know, he's from North Carolina and I'm from Texas, and we've just been moved to California. So in short, it's a very, very, very complicated process.
It almost sounds like you didn't feel the benefits of the MOVE Act out there in California. Now, something might happen between Washington and California to make the effect fade, but you know, the online stuff, it doesn't, I'm not hearing that there. Let's continue on and get some more feedback. If that was fascinating. Don.
Coming to it from an academic point of view, you're always giving grades to people, so I was going to give it a 7 as the equivalent of a 70, which is the minimally passing C grade. In other words, I think the move was acceptable work. It didn't blow my socks off in the way it was innovated, and for primarily the reasons that you heard right over here was the education aspect of it, that those who were overseas, particularly those who were overseas, although there is an impact in CONUS, didn't know how to use it well, and there were clearly some confusions there, combined with these wide variation in state laws. How can we expect these voting officers to actually understand all these different jurisdictions, and even one, what is a jurisdiction? Okay.
Eric.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm probably with Paul. I'm at probably a 6 or a 7. You know, obviously, from my perspective, there were some hiccups in 2010 with some of the initial state implementation of the law. But the one thing I saw, at least in 2012, was a tremendous effort by the states, as well as by the Department of Justice, to really make sure that the state components of the MOVE Act were implemented in a timely manner, made sure that ballots went out on time, made sure ballots were counted. But I still think we have some work to make sure that that the other requirements of making sure that service members are registered, have requested an absentee ballot well enough in advance of the election to actually have their votes counted. I still think we have some work to do there.
Okay, so we're touching consistently on outreach and education in here. And David, we definitely want your score, but you know, there might be a little bias there.
Well, I don't know if I can give a score or grade. Since we're in a university setting, I kind of equate it to, we've taken a final exam and we're still waiting for that grade to come in, because we have our surveys out in the field. We're waiting for those numbers, just like you shared with us this morning. And that's really what's going to determine the overall level of success that we've had in terms of where have we been and where are we going.
Can you give us some specifics on, or even one example of something that is really positive that came out of the MOVE Act?
Well, I think just from hearing the discussion earlier today in terms of our footprint, in terms of communication and what we've seen through our website, for example. I mean, the total number of FPCAs that were formally downloaded from our website total roughly just under 1 million. In terms of the federal right and absentee ballot, the total number of transactions numbered just under 200,000. The federal write-in absentee ballot, for those of you who are not aware, it's not something we like to see, but it is a backup ballot in case they do not receive, the voter does not receive their official ballot from their local election official. But it is something that we do recognize there's value in it. We spend a lot of time accommodating redistricting with our wizard. That is just one aspect of our footprint that we saw for the first time, the level of outreach. In particular, the MOVE Act was very specific in terms of what FVAP had to be doing in terms of communicating directly to the soldier in the field with releasing 90, 60, and 30-day email blasts throughout the election cycle. We met that and exceeded that, and the total number of emails that were delivered totaled 18 million. So if there's any one group, I think, of voter that is very familiar with the Federal Voting Assistance Program, I would be the active duty military. Anyone who had a .mil email account received our emails, and I think, if anything, they became an irritant for them, and probably rightly so.
In California, they delete them.
I'm not sure about California, but I think that gives some evidence in terms of the level of outreach engagement. Not only are we meeting the congressional requirement, but we're exceeding it. And that was also true with our advertising campaign, public service announcements that ran on Armed Forces Network. So the outreach, the level of engagement was clearly there, and we saw that pay dividends. And let me give another example from the discussion earlier.
Okay, just one more short one.
One more short
because,
one.
you know, they're going to get uptight
just
over there.
anecdotally, and this is just to capture how your organization and an FVAP work together. There was a discussion about how are military voters becoming aware of how to track their ballot so much? And I would hazard to guess that they're very familiar with FVAP.gov because on our landing page we do advertise very clearly the 3 steps, including requesting your ballot, obtaining your ballot from a state system or through our federal write-in absentee ballot wizard, but then finally being able to track your ballot. And we provide that launch point off to a state or local website so that they can provide that service.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you have done a lot, but there's clearly, what's interesting is the disconnect that sort of starts right between Eric and you, where over there it's like education, outreach, and here you're doing a lot, but we're still in the process. Like you said, it's still not enough.
That's correct.
Definitely not from us, I know, at OVF. But we did see a lot of great work from the FVAP of moving end user voters out to the states who can service them, and a lot of times even more than, or better, because of the election official network that's out there. I'm going to give Eric an opportunity to counter this in case you want to mention any specific shortcoming you saw of MOVE, and then we'll probably move off this topic into the next one.
Well, I'll be brief. I mean, I still think this, and I've been an advocate for this for a long time, I still think this is very much about the process up front, what we call getting service members and their dependents, overseas citizens, election ready, so that when the time comes, they're able to participate in the election and decide at that time. But what we've seen in this process, what we've seen for a long time now, is that the registration process, the absentee ballot process, all becomes a last-minute rush in late October, September. And so all the benefits of sending out a ballot 45 days before the election become diminished if someone requests a ballot 20 days before the election. Not to mention the fact then you start running into state deadlines. So, in this particular election, a lot of the activities started in the 1st of October. Well, guess what? 12 states have registration deadlines of October 9th. So immediately roadblocks, then you start running into mistakes, and then you start running into the process of whether they have enough time to actually receive and return their ballot and actually have it counted.
That's a very good point. We have absolutely seen the last-minute rush. One of the things that, I don't know if you agree with this, but or you actually, David, that once things go online, voters don't think they have to do it in advance. And they think they can do it all instantly.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, please.
I talked with a lot of Texas election administrators, and most recently I just left Jackie Callanan in Bexar County with San Antonio, as well as another little small county that I like to compare big county, small county to. And this last minute rush was a big problem for her, combined with this other education thing. the voting assistance officers, not understanding the system completely. And we can put a lot of hate and discontent on these voting assistance officers, but we need to remember that's not their real job. You know, they're really doing something else out there, and then they're just kind of saddled with this, oh, by the way, in all your spare time between midnight and 6 a.m., you get to figure out how to do this. They were getting in San Antonio from airmen who were actually stationed in San Antonio requests for the email ballot 3 days before the election, which of course they had to refuse, which you can say, well, they should have known better, but of course, what does the airman think at the other end? The government just told me that I'm military and I can't vote. Right. That's the story that comes across. Whether it's fair or not is irrelevant. That's the story. So there is this education on both sides. These voting assistance officers not getting the correct information out for who knows what reason. And then the young airman who wasn't paying attention. But yes, I think we're talking about 85% of the U.S. military is under the age of 30. Okay, so that's the group of population in the country that tends to not vote. So we should be thrilled that they want to vote, and apparently they do vote at a slightly higher rate than everybody else. But they don't pay attention to stuff like that. It's not the group that tends to do that, and they're all very busy.
If I can shed some light on the overall context of, especially in terms of what the Federal Voting Assistance Program does. And I think, you're spot on in terms of that there's always a rush towards Election Day. But as a former election official in both Texas and Florida, I can tell you that there's a level of responsibility that is split between the election official versus the voter, or in the campaigns, that everyone has a role to play. But within the Federal Voting Assistance Program and our specific instruction and guidance in terms of to the VAOs and how they should be implementing assistance is that January and July of every year, they distribute the federal postcard application so that they have an opportunity, the soldiers in their units have the opportunity to update their addresses, get their federal postcard application on file. Combined with the 90, 60, 30-day focus, it doesn't take away from your core point, which is that there is that rush towards the election day. But I think you had to look at also the 2012 cycle and what is unique about it. And one of the real challenges, and I think you've identified in your report, was really, I think, the Help America Vote Act and the period of eligibility for the federal postcard application.
Yeah.
And that really did cause some problems, especially as you approach the primary. And with a front-loaded primary schedule start in March, and we had one party with a contested primary. So you have kind of a lopsided effect versus 2008 because both parties were engaged in a very competitive primary cycle. So the number of applications increased. People were mobilized much earlier. And I think that's what had this eventual impact towards later on in the calendar year. It doesn't take away from what your core point is, but we also recognize the limitations of the VAO structure and the voting assistance guide. In an ideal world, I think we would have a greater level of standardization among the states on how elections should be conducted for absentee voting. But that's really meant to provide guidance, assist them. But Congress was very specific in terms of the role FVAP was going to play in a new role in being a central resource and specifically requiring us to develop a very expansive, robust information portal.
Well, what's clear is that not any one organization or party can do everything, and not all voters are ever going to go to one place, and that's why there's the network and their organizations and their parties, and we want the good services to be ubiquitous, even though they might differ, but across all those different
one of the big ways that a lot of these, again, I look at it from my research from the election administrator's point of view and what's the impact on them, because they're the people that have to make it work, is the crunches that they get into between the federal requirement for the 45 days and various state issues. For example, in Texas, from the time the last election was validated until they had to have the ballots out was 10 days. Well, that's an awful lot of work. Now, the smart administrators are preloading their work and they're getting it done and they're doing that. But nevertheless, that's not very much time to get all of that stuff done and then out the door. And to Texas's credit, well, statewide they say they did it 100%. I happen to know that that wasn't completely true. But it was the little counties that weren't able to do it, and it was those little counties where the the county clerk was the elected administrator with one part-time assistant. So it was one of those things, and we're talking
Right.
about.
And MOVE definitely puts stress on election
Yeah.
administration.
So that's the difference.
I'd like to let Laura comment as well here and segue to a related topic that's part of MOVE. I'll come back to the ease grants after this, but as a next topic. But skip into the topic of installation voting assistance offices, which became somewhat of a controversy this year. This was sort of a part of, or hinged onto the MOVE Act somehow. Somehow not right up in the beginning, but there's stories behind all of this. We won't go into the backstories, you know. Anyhow, the GAO came out with a report this year scolding the implementation of voter registration, or sort of like motor voter type thing, on each military installation. There was supposed to be an office where military voters could go and get help. Kind of a replacement for, or a support to the VAO system, if I understand. Now, Laura, did you have one of those offices on the base that you were visiting there? And
at 29 Palms, I visited, first of all, with the installation voting assistance officer. And he was a retired Marine working as a CIV. And he told me that in the time he had set up the office and he had 3 lower-level Marines underneath him to be his gophers, that in that whole entire time period of probably 2 years, he had only had 2 Marines come to his office. I am the type of person, when I drive on a base, I'm looking for signage. All right, and I didn't see the signage that I really wanted to see in big letters, how to vote, go to FVAP, okay? We have some signage that's very patriotic, and that's wonderful, because we're all patriots, I'm sure, in this room. But you have to make it simple, because Marines are like bullets. They whiz by, all right? They have this attention span, and had talking to their wives, they'll confirm that. And I found that one of my best allies, being a boot on the ground, was talking to the wives, who would say, oh, well, my husband won't do this unless I bring it home. So I would give her the app. She'd already fill it out. She'd explain to her what she needed to do and what he needed to do so that it would happen. At the same time, I had another wife who said, my husband in 2008 was out in a field exercise for 6 weeks and happened to fall during the election. And she said she went into the command there and said, well, my husband wants to vote. I know he wants to vote. So what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, we just really can't do anything about it. But I hope I'm making a point here that we need an enormous amount of education. The education has to come earlier. We have several states who still have their primaries in August and September. To you, Secretary of State's here, if there's any snowball's chance, and of course we had snowballs this morning to greet me from California, snowball's chance of having those states that have September primaries, including Massachusetts is the last, and New York is in that boat, moving them back to earlier August. That would make a stupendous difference in allowing more people more time to, get involved in the process. Now, let's just think here as civilians for a second. We always think that Labor Day is kind of the kickoff for the elections, right? I mean, it's kind of like everybody's really talking about it. For those of us who are politically sensitive, elections are a 24/7, 12-month, a year affair. But for the average person out there, it's not. So we're not the average person in this room. We're not the average Marine, sailor, or pilot. So education is key. Another suggestion I have for the Secretaries of States is that some of you have extra time for those mail-in ballots to come in, all right? Some of you do, some of you don't. Kentucky does not have an extension passed in the last election, of course, November 6th. What if there was some uniformity so that for our military and overseas voters who may not have access to electronic, and believe me, out there in the middle of Afghanistan, there's no access to any electronics, and the electronics that you might have access to are tied up for official military business most of the time, okay? Therefore, the mail ballot, how about all the states saying, okay, we're going to give you all an extra 7 days. Make it uniform across the country so that there is one standard, just like there is the first Tuesday in November every 4 years. We vote for our commander-in-chief.
Okay, now what I'm hearing is that, or what I see happening is that uniformity is like, it's like a virus, you know, you get some here and it starts to spread, and then you see the next thing you want to invade and make uniform, and that's kind of interesting. I never thought about it that way until you started mentioning it. I never, you know, it's true. That's one of the things about UOCAVA that is not uniform. This post-election, get your ballot in deadline. I want to interrupt you, though. I'm sorry, but I really have to move to quick comments here on this point about installation voting officers. Your comment on that was 2 people went in there in a couple of years or something, not being used. The GAO said it wasn't there. The FVAP says it is there. And Eric Eversole, I can't remember where you fall now, post or after or whatever. But Eric, would you mind saying, where do you land on that in less than 30 minutes, please?
Okay, I can definitely do that. You know, we've had a lot of discussion about the unit voting assistance officers and about how it can be a very complicated process. It's a collateral duty. Well, guess what? It was a complicated process, and those same requirements existed back in 2008 when Congress said, you know what? We gotta stop relying on unit voting assistance officers as the sole means of providing registration assistance to service members. We need to find a more systematic approach, an approach that's used similar to what civilians use when they go to a driver's license branch. And we want it to be done as part of the check-in process, because when service members check in or check out of a duty station, what's happened? Their address has changed. It means their voting information has changed. The place where they're likely to get their absentee ballot has changed. And so from my perspective, that's why Congress made this a big part of the MOVE Act. And in fact, Senator Schumer, one of the lead authors of the MOVE Act, called it the cornerstone of the act, that we need to find a more systematic approach for service members to participate in the process. And again, this is the same process civilians typically get when they go to the driver's license branch. It's governed by the National Voter Registration Act. Susan, you pointed out the IG report. That's really the tip of the iceberg, because creating the offices is one thing, but making sure that they actually provide services when the service member checks in, well, that's another requirement. And as Laura just pointed out, if 2 people have come in, then those services aren't being provided when they check in.
Susan, can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
You know, I look at this from a political science perspective. The United States has a voter turnout problem. With all the hoopla around our elections, with all the money spent, people don't turn out in large numbers. We also know that there are various new convenience voting systems in the United States for domestic voters, and people sometimes use them or not. When you think about overseas voters, they are in a bubble. They're not exposed to any of the hoopla. They certainly are not going to be as contacted as much by political parties.
It's wonderful.
And candidates. and so we create these new systems, and sometimes the people we intend to use them don't know about them. The system Maryland uses, I oversaw the design and implementation, and I worked with Claire Smith, one of your colleagues, to find out who used it and what, and we learned some things. For one thing, the kind of message you send out telling people about a new system has a major impact. And there might not be enough signs around military bases, but we can tell you something about email. Email communications that have source credibility, that link the person to their reference groups, their home states and overseas or military voters, that are intriguing because they say something like, hey, there's a new policy, but don't give any details, and are concise and clear. Just even the subject line have a huge impact much greater than any other communications in turning out the vote.
We also see that, of course, because we're continually in test phase with email marketing. Boy, it seems like there's no end to things that can go wrong, but when it does go right, and that individual message is really a value message for the voter, that's good. But yeah, I was just going to say, Eric, they're the two approaches, obviously.
Right, there are.
There's the physical, I'm there, and how is that implemented, making a big difference, that physical registration office. But there's also the targeted personal one. I don't think anybody's saying it's one or the other.
Right.
We're saying it's both, and both have to be done right. You saw that being done right. I think that David desperately wants to make a comment about about the installation voting right.
You can just feel the
being
energy.
done right. Yeah, and I must allow you that.
I appreciate that. The big thing with the IVA offices, I think, is that in terms of overall compliance, the way the MOVE Act was written in terms of NVRA, and I'll let the attorneys negotiate exactly what is NVRA compliance in terms of declination forms. It gets into the weeds quickly. We don't need to go there.
Now I'm not speaking English, but all right.
Well, it's a real big, when you go to the driver's license.
Right, it's okay for me. But.
Setting that aside, in terms of overall compliance, the IVA offices are wholly compliant with the MOVE Act. There are over 200 locations. The big challenge we ran into with the Inspector General was the issue of information that was posted on our website that was outdated. We recognized that, worked quickly with the services, and did quality assurance checks on all the contact information. I can tell you that we are currently working with a federal-funded research development center to analyze the implementation of the IVA offices to find out what works best.
Okay, well, that's good news.
And one of the big things is keep in mind that a lot of what I hear in my specialty comes from the world of conducting elections. And when you're talking about a network of 13,000 UVAOs, and you're talking about 220 installations, and you're talking about a command and control structure that goes from the Department of Defense to the services, there's a lot of discretion that is given to installation commanders in trying to find the resources and where they can house this IVA office. We have to give that flexibility, and so in those terms, that's where what we call the FFRDC will help us identify what are the best practices, what is the most effective way for us to provide assistance, and that's what we'll take back for action.
Well, to be honest, I think it's not too surprising that we're overly enthusiastic about how long it takes to put such a vast program into place, and that what was hoped for takes a little longer, but it's being perfected now. You're analyzing it. We just want to encourage you to do that with common data format because it sounds like, whoa, it is big.
Well, if we can go to this common data format, I'm
that
happy
would
to
be
go
great. Are you going to keep me here, Eric?
No, just quickly. I mean, there's two aspects of this, and I think that obviously when these changes are being made in September and October, that's problematic from a compliance perspective. The second aspect of this, and this is even according to your own data, last year, this past election cycle, you only helped 44,000 spouses. There's 1.2 million military spouses out there. That's 3.7%.
Well, which is funny because in the calendar year 12, we supported 1.2 million visits to IVA offices. So there is a disconnect in the overall entire calendar year.
Okay, well, there's
data and there's data.
Conflicting data. But good, we have data. And I know Eric likes data.
I love data.
We'll give you some more. All right, let's talk about the ease grants because, I mean, in the election world, you put $25 million out there and you watch people, scratch and kill to get it. It's great. It's amazing to get that kind of money in a down economy, for people to invest, to say, okay, the states get to use this and the counties get to use this and everybody can apply. And yeah, so what happened with all that money? That's what we want to know now. And I know I think everybody here knows it's in process. We've got till 2016 till these grants wear out. Some people even want more. Yeah, but, I'm going to ask you, honestly, David and the others, what's happened with this? Has it been tremendous? I know what we did with it with some states and what we hoped to do and didn't get to do with other states and we were crying about and whining to you as well. So personally, we have a mixed feeling about it at OVF. We're thankful that we survived The EASE grant process, we're not done with it. It almost killed us. We came out with some good technology. I think some other places did. But how are we going to see? How is the general public going to see? What happened with this? Did it go right?
Well, and I think we're currently receiving all of the reports from the jurisdictions that we.
For what?
Well, that's where we will go into another reporting process to determine what the numbers are indicating, and in terms of justifying any future type of activity for funding this type of innovative technology. I mean, one of the big issues with the MOVE Act was that the states were charged with providing some sort of alternative electronic delivery means. Mm-hmm. And so really, in order to kickstart the level of service provided to active duty military and overseas civilians, we wanted to see that type of embrace. And the best way for us to do that, applying some lessons learned we learned in 2010 with our electronic voting support wizard, which is a very small-scale pilot, but it was a precursor. And we ran into, if you thought it was a headache now, going through that exercise in terms of federal acquisition, in which the Department of Defense was very much involved, we felt the grants gave the greatest level of flexibility. And so I think in those terms, they have been received well. I think in terms of communication, that's what I think we'll have to wait and see, and how much that system was fully integrated within the participating jurisdictions, and how much folks became dependent upon it.
Okay, I'm going to stop here so we have time for the others to make a comment.
One comment I made was that when I talked about the level of assistance at the IVA offices, that includes UVAO and IVA offices.
And for active duty, right?
Which means Unit Voting Assistance Officer.
Combined.
Installation Voting Assistance Officer for all those who...
Sorry, my acronyms.
Let me
all right,
jump in on Bear County.
Yeah, I'd like to get
Bear
some
County
response.
got an EASE grant. I think it was $300,000 and some odd over 3 years. And they used it to contract a company to do their electronic balloting for their blank ballot to go out. That part worked really well. They learned a lot. It made it easier for them. Again, that 10 days, they had to turn that around. That particular contractor was doing several Texas counties, so there was, and some others. That part seemed to work pretty well. But here's where the open data thing jumps in here, is they were using a proprietary data format, a proprietary program. Mm-hmm. So one of the neat things supposedly they did was they would send out this PDF that you could just check the blocks, and then it would create a barcode with all of your voting data embedded into it, so that the local offices, when they get it back, could just scan that, and it would automatically populate the real ballot that they were going to put into the system. Couldn't do that because it was proprietary and they weren't going to release that. Now, apparently they've agreed to do that for 2014, but this opens the question of, well, okay, that county gets it, but the county right next to them doesn't get that, because they didn't get the EASE grant to do that. So it really brings into a haves and haves not.
And that's a point we thought of very often, how the money in a certain way was a great inspiration for innovation, but ended up with being something of a scatter plot around the U.S.
And you're going to find that when the states and jurisdictions have flexibility to do their own acquisitions. And this reminds me very much of the Help America Vote Act, when electronic voting systems were being purchased. Each county and local jurisdiction that was soliciting had different requirements. So if you're not thinking in those terms like you just described, and trying to build that up front, that's going to be an ongoing problem. It is an ongoing problem in terms of proprietary systems, but I think that's what it speaks to, and that's what hopefully we will digest and be able to understand exactly what everyone was experiencing.
That's a very good point.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought some of the EASE grant money was more than just electronic databases, and so now you have some states with online registration systems. And you do get into a situation where it is a have or have not type of situation, because it's not just about whether they have the ability to download a ballot online now. It's whether they're going to be able to. California, I think, was one of the states that used that money.
Right, but the EASE grant wasn't used for online voter registration, to my knowledge, was it, David?
Yes.
It was?
I believe portions of it. We did not fund their system entirely, I believe. But
well, we're going to have to close this. We're still running a bit late. I think, Paul, you possibly had something to say on the MOVE Act, on the EASE grants in Maryland, because you were a recipient.
I don't think. Did we get one? Because it didn't come by my desk.
Okay, that says everything. I'm going to allow 2 questions before we break for our break, and we're continuing to be a little bit late, but we started late. We're finishing a little late. It's not desperate. So I do think a couple questions are in order. The panels, this group has been fabulous, I think. I hope for you as well. Who's our runner with the mic? We got Brian back there. Questions? Okay, you got an early break. Let's wait before you go. I swear to come back at. We are running 15 minutes late. So who's got an agenda? I think we're going to be at. Well, why don't we say? How about we try for 10 of 4? And try means really try. Okay. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thanks.